listener production.
Hi, Sacha Barbour Gatt with you. Welcome to The Briefing. Today we're bringing you part 2 of our special series on MDMA-assisted therapy, helping to treat those experiencing PTSD. In part 1, we spoke to the co-founders of the Pax Centre on how MDMA-assisted therapy works. But what is it actually like to go through it?
Taking these tablets, doing the MDMA, was like a high-pressure cleaner that just removed all of that built up trauma and left me with who I always was.
In part 2, we're speaking with Kate, a patient at the Pax Centre who has undertaken the treatment, and she shares how it gave her a sense of peace she's never experienced before. That's coming up in the second half of this episode. First, though, time for the headlines with Chris Spiru. It's Wednesday, October 30.
Morning, Sash. Morning, everybody. Lockdowns and mandatory vaccines are unlikely to fly with Australians again, and trust in politicians has been eroded, and that's in the wake of the country's COVID response. Those are the biggest takeaways from the first independent review into how our politicians manage the pandemic. The year-long inquiry was commissioned by the Albanese government, but was carried out by an independent panel led by a senior public servant, an economist, and an infectious disease expert. The report, which is just short of 1,000 pages long, highlighted the ongoing impacts of Australia's response, including on people's mental health, on school kids, and on the economy. Treasurer Jim Chalmers admitting billions of dollars was wasted on COVID payments, and that is continuing to impact the economy today.
The modelling cited in the report says that the extended policy support, which didn't always move in line with the health advice, meant that peak inflation was at least 2 percentage points higher than it could have been.
Now, it's not all bad news. Leaders have been praised for their early response to COVID. So that means things like shutting down Australia's borders and enforcing the national lockdown. But poor communication and heavy-handed restrictions later on, both at a state and Commonwealth level, that eroded public confidence and trust. So the inquiry has recommended setting up a Centre of Disease Control to kind of streamline the response to any future pandemics. God, I hope that doesn't happen, but still, good to be prepared. That is already happening. It's expected to be set up by 2026. And studies on the impact on children and on population-wide mental health have also been recommended. So the things that this inquiry looked at, weren't kind of going into individual specific decisions and what guided them. It was kind of a broader look, and it didn't consider, or there wasn't enough weight given to the human rights implications of decisions. So, for example, I was in Melbourne during COVID for nearly all of COVID, which was so much fun. Victoria's heavy-handed approach to enforcing social distancing was criticised by the inquiry for lacking evidence and eroding compliance. While in New South Wales, you might remember, Chris, you were here, there were zones of certain Sydney suburbs
the
where
red zones.
you were a red zone. You couldn't go to work, but people in the next suburb over could. It was absolutely bizarre policy. And the inquiry said that, those kind of restrictions disproportionately affected certain groups like Indigenous people, those with unsafe home environments, and people whose main language at home was not English. So almost 5 years later, this inquiry says children are still suffering from mental health and academic consequences of school closures. People are more reluctant to receive vaccines, which I think is a really huge flow-on effect. There are elective surgery backlogs, and our frontline workers are exhausted and burnt out, which is, we can't ignore that. While the inquiry has praised the fact that our death toll was definitely not, was managed pretty well, especially in the early days. It could have been so much worse. And Australia fared much better than most other countries. So we have to pat ourselves on the back for that. But this inquiry has said, we should be looking more into the mental health impacts and how it impacted kids, because we are still seeing the flow-on effects today.
We're talking about Qantas again this morning, Sash, with revelations as many as 90% of federal politicians are members of the Chairman's Lounge. That is the very exclusive invitation-only club that is frequented by Australia's elite, so think sports stars, celebs and media personalities. Analysis of the Parliament's Register of Pecuniary Interest shows at least 209 politicians have declared their membership. So there are, for context, 227 members and senators in the 47th Parliament, Sash.
Now, of course, we're talking about Qantas and the Chairman's Lounge again. It's all under increased scrutiny at the moment amid claims Anthony Albanese had a very tight relationship with the former Qantas boss, Alan Joyce, which may have influenced his government's policies. These are all claims in a new book by a journalist called Joe Aston. Yesterday, yesterday, the PM was once again forced to defend himself.
I have always acted in an open and transparent way, and in my time in public life, I have acted with integrity. I have acted in a way that is entirely appropriate.
Yeah, and also once again saying those 22 flight upgrades were all declared and it was all fine.
Yeah.
He was quizzed on whether he actually went to Alan Joyce and asked specifically for these upgrades, and he kind of really danced around that, which was interesting. Opposition leader Peter Dutton, meantime, has seized on the political opportunity for a pile-on. He is calling for Albo to refer himself to the corruption watchdog. Don't expect this story to go away anytime soon.
And rapper 50 Cent has revealed he knocked back $3 million to perform at Donald Trump's Madison Square Garden rally.
I'm afraid of politics, bro. So you understand. I do not like
You don't like
part of politics.
no gangbang or politics.
No gangbang, no politics. You know, it's because when you do get involved in it, no matter how you feel, someone passionately disagrees with you.
That was 50 speaking on The Breakfast Club there.
Yeah, he says he's afraid of politics, but he's spoken in support of the Republican nominee before. And one of his songs, now this wasn't his fault, but it happened. It's called Many Men Wish Death. This became an anthem for Trump supporters after the assassination attempt on him. So it hit the top 10 on iTunes following the shooting in July and surged in popularity on other streaming platforms. Now, what 50 did do in response was share an edited version of the album cover that had Trump's face on it. So he's definitely played into it. Hey, and look, speaking of the Madison Square Garden rally, the fallout is continuing. So Trump has been forced to kind of address it. First off, he said he was asked to denounce the comments made by the comedian Tony Hinchcliffe, and he goes, "Oh, well, I didn't hear them." So he didn't denounce them because he says he didn't hear them. He also called this rally in New York City, which has been condemned for these racist remarks, but also just misogynistic comments and things like that. Trump declared it as a love fest. The quote was, "The love in that room, it was breathtaking." Sorry, I had to roll out my Trump impression at least once before the election. Yeah. Kamala Harris, meantime, has been focusing on positive messaging. She's speaking about hope in Washington, D.C. And Chris, 1 week to go.
And very briefly now, we just want to touch on some results from our broadcast channel on Instagram, so at The Briefing Podcast. We put out a prompt yesterday asking you, our listeners, if you would actually try MDMA-assisted therapy. And Sash, I can report 89% of briefers said that they would after listening to episode 1. I suspect that number will climb more, even though it's a very high number. I suspect that number will climb more after listening to this deep dive coming up now.
Yeah, that's happening right now. We're speaking to Kate, who actually went through the therapy herself. It's a really, really interesting listen. A diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder can change your entire life. The psychiatric disorder can present in people who have witnessed or been involved in a traumatic event. Think troops in war or being the first responder to a multi-fatality car crash. The impact of the disorder is far-reaching, from your home life to your work life, your relationships, and how you view yourself. They can all be permanently damaged. Treatment is usually a commitment of months, if not years. It's complicated, but people can be cured of it. So what happens when the PTSD you're suffering from doesn't respond to therapy or traditional medications? For most who suffer from treatment-resistant PTSD, it represents the end of the line, a roadblock on the path to being well again. This is what happened to WA mum Kate. She got to the point where she was desperate for any relief and willing to try anything. That's when she was introduced to the work of the Pax Centre. That's the specialised mental health clinic we heard about on yesterday morning's episode of The Briefing. It was here that Kate was able to access MDMA-assisted therapy to treat her PTSD, and she says it cured her. In part 2 of The Briefing special series, we're hearing Kate's story. And just a note, to protect her privacy, we've chosen not to use her real name. Kate, welcome to The Briefing. Tell me how you came to know about the Pax Centre.
Yeah, so what brought me, it was a bit of a long road, actually, what initially brought me there. It was about 3 years ago. And it came off the back of, I've had the last 10 years been working as a paramedic on road in the metro area, done a little bit of country as well. Over that time, seen a lot of trauma, a lot of things happen, but all those things I felt like I dealt with at the time and sort of moved on appropriately. And then about 3 years ago, there was one job that I remember. And it was that one moment where I felt like something had broken. I remember being in the patient's house, seeing the events that I saw, and that was it. I can't even really describe it really from there. It was a really surreal moment. I remember messaging my husband and going like, this is it, this is capital T, the job. Everyone sort of talks about it on the road and, I hope that doesn't happen to me. But yeah, it's something it was the straw that broke the camel's back. And from that moment, I didn't really know what to do. There was a lot of, I guess, sort of sunk a bit into a bit more of a depression sort of a state. Where do I get help from here? And I did see a psychiatrist initially, but that just did not gel very well. And I was like, oh, this is not for me. And I just sort of put my hands up in the air, didn't know what to do. And it wasn't until months later that I had someone on road point me in the direction of the Pax Centre. And every day I thank that person for sending me there.
And were you seeking treatment specifically for PTSD, or was it a range of kind of mental health conditions that you were trying to get treatment for?
So I had absolutely no mental health history. Just a bit of context, for my childhood, growing up, all great. And I never actually really realised I had PTSD. It was only until I even asked in the briefing for the MDMA, and I was like, am I actually... I'm diagnosed with this, right? Because for me, it was just, I'm in a crisis and I don't know what to do and I need help. So the diagnosis and things just really wasn't important to me. I just felt like this wasn't normal and I don't want to live like this.
I wanted to ask you what you knew about MDMA and MDMA-assisted therapy before the treatment started, if anything.
So I knew nothing. The only thing that I knew before stepping into my first dosing day was watching the Netflix series, I believe it's called Open Your Mind, and there was a segment about MDMA, and it's what I got told to watch for a bit more background information, and that's it, what I knew going in. At that point, not that I didn't care, but I was just at the point where I was like, I will try anything. I need to do this I've got a 4-year-old daughter, an 18-month-old son. I need to do anything to save my marriage, my relationship with my kids. It wasn't about saving my career. I felt like that had gone. The moment I had that job, it was just, everything kind of went up in flames for me. But it was about trying to salvage what I had left. So I would just try anything.
So tell me what it was like the morning you woke up for your first dosing day. Take me through the emotions, how you were feeling, and, the moments leading up to that first dose. Tell me about that.
It was pretty surreal. I had to it was a school day for my daughter. So I got an Uber to go to the clinic. So saying goodbye to my family was just sort of like, we just didn't know what was going to happen. My husband later said the whole day he was just worried I was locked in 9 hours of my worst nightmare. And, I'm going to be rocking back and forth in a corner. But I was really curious about it. It wasn't until, so we did all the checks, got in the room, and I was like, yeah, okay. Did take the medication. I was just like, cool, now what? Do I just dive straight in? What kind of happens? And they were just sort of like, oh, just have a general chat, just get comfortable, let the medicine have its onset. I was just like, oh, okay, just sat on this bed. The lights are dimmed. The room is absolutely gorgeous. It's a beautiful atmosphere. There's music softly playing, and I was just like, yeah, cool, now what? And then the onset happened, and I was just like, it was honestly like being like, okay, see you, bye. I'll see you in 9 hours. And that was it. I was down the rabbit hole, Alice in Wonderland style. And that was it. I didn't surface until it was a late one for them that night. It was a whole day of just that expression of going inwards.
Wow. So it sounds like you went in without any kind of expectations as to what would physically, I suppose, or, what the bodily experience would be, both within your own head but also physically. Was it frightening then when you started to feel the onset of the medication, when you started to feel it take over, or were you just so open to it that you went with the flow, I suppose, is a way to say it?
Onset was for me, but apparently I might be quite sensitive to medication, so this may not be the same for everyone. Like watching the Netflix show, people are up walking around the room, they're talking, they're crying, whereas I basically had no ability to get up. So there was a bit of nausea. It felt like when I got put under anaesthetic, when I had an eye surgery. So just that feeling of the body just kind of slowing down, becoming very heavy, needing to lay down. So good thing I was sat in a bed. And then that was it. I could lay myself down, but I think I struggled even getting like the doona over me. And then they had to I could place my hands on my chest, like sort of try and get comfy, but it was just straight into it. I couldn't even ask or put on the eye mask and the headset. It was only because they asked and I had the ability to say yes that I wanted it on. Basically being anaesthetic, lost the ability to move, to speak. It just became totally all-consuming. And that was okay. There was nothing, it sounds frightening when I've described it to people, but it was a beautiful thing. It was such a gift to be able to go to a retreat in your mind, basically, to have your body physically unable to, or for me it was, I was physically unable to move. I couldn't speak, but it meant that all those errant thoughts in my mind, that constant little chatterbox in your head that might give you doubts and, all the anxious messages I was getting and all the rest of it, it just stopped. It just went away. And I had nothing but time, uninterrupted time to just go into this new kind of feeling of what ended up being peace. Throughout the day, I got very, very cold at first. And not just cold as in it's a pretty cold day. It was like to my bones, freezing. And because I had a lot of difficulty speaking, took a while to say the word cold. And then as soon as I could say that, they popped another blanket on and life was great. And then later in the day, I got like incredibly hot. So again, blankets came off, all was good. And there was no panic with, it doesn't repress the respiratory system, like my breathing was fine. It just took away what I needed to be taken away at that time, is what I felt. And that was those thoughts in my head and the ability to just stop and just be present in the moment.
So I'm interested from a treatment perspective then, and you've described it as like going into a retreat for your mind. Was the intention then, the two people that were with you, were they then asking you questions about the event that happened to try and get you to start working through it? Was this first session more of just experiencing the MDMA and understanding the effect it was going to have on your body ahead of further treatment? What was the process in terms of the treatment aspect of this medication?
So you're in the room with two therapists, but there's also another therapist in the room, which is the MDMA, which again, I didn't realise till I was under the influence of it. And really the MDMA did the bulk of the work, not discounting who was in the room, like they were incredibly important. And all the sessions afterwards, very important. I actually didn't have the ability to speak anyway. For them, it would have been like watching paint dry, honestly. I would have been laying on a bed for like 9 hours or something with a mask on, armour and all the rest of it. And they just check in every now and then. It's just like, are you okay? I'm like hand on the shoulder just to check in. And I'd just be like, I'd just say yes. And then I'd be left alone. It was almost like having that eye mask on and the headphones on. It created a world to be a part of and to be curious about, to explore, that I couldn't do on a conscious, like an unmedicated level, I guess I should say. And whenever the eye mask got taken off, the headphones got taken off to talk to them or to get up, maybe go to the toilet, whatnot, it was like putting a bookmark in a book. Like I didn't really progress in that journey.
So, Kate, you described to us, what the first day was like, the first dosing day. Tell me how different the second dosing day was for you.
So I went into the second dosing day expecting it to be the same as the first. I went to all these beautiful kind of gardens and meadows in my mind. There was all these beautiful, beautiful places. And I went into the second one and I got nothing. It was just black. There was no movement. I was just stationary. I just felt like, well, this is doing nothing. I might as well just go home. I still had very similar physical responses to the medication. So when I took it, I wasn't able to just kind of get up and walk around. It did sort of leave me laying on the bed, not really being able to move. I did lose sensation in the hands and feet at times, but this was all okay. It didn't worry me at all. It was just the journey itself was so vastly different, and probably time means nothing to me in that room. It could have been half the day that I just got nowhere. I tried to think of things. I was like, okay, I've really got to resolve these issues. Let's think about these things in terms of the job, maybe my life. But being under MDMA, I found I didn't have the choice as to what I thought of. So an example would be, let's think about an errant thought like a shopping list. I wouldn't have the ability to keep hold of that thought. It would just sort of disappear, quite gently, but it was sort of like, you don't need to think about this right now, so just let it go. And so I'm waiting, and still nothing's happening, and I'm starting to get really quite annoyed. And then it sort of, at some point in all of that, I realised that this is where I needed to be. So it was kind of a lesson learned to be open to whatever the medication brings up for you and to follow that path. And for me on that day, that path was anger.
Yeah, so tell me then, how many days and how many sessions with dosing of MDMA did you actually do?
I did 2. I could have done a max of 3.
So I'm interested then in the link between taking the medicine and then doing the therapy side of it, where I'm guessing, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that is when you started to talk about the trauma and started to work through the PTSD and try and heal from it, or at least come to a better understanding of it. So what did taking the MDMA actually do for those therapy sessions where you weren't dosing?
Thinking about the dosing days is like trying to recall a dream. So it is actually sometimes a little bit difficult to fully grasp, remember exactly what happened. But by allowing myself to, for example, express the emotion of anger that I had suppressed for many, many years, it removed that barricade, it removed a dam to let everything start flowing again, sort of become more connected to myself. My mind in the months afterwards was like if you shake up a snow globe. I just couldn't really, even following conversations, and I just had to wait for that to settle, really. And it wasn't a scary thing or anything. It was just my mind had obviously so much that it needed to do that it just needed time. And with that, it's just sort of opened up those feelings of being, I guess, reconnected within myself and therefore with the life around me, to be open to discuss things in therapy that I didn't want to discuss, I didn't know needed to be discussed or acknowledged. It just sort of really opened those doors to the process of healing, really.
You've described how you were desperate at this point for anything. You were willing to try anything, and that led you to the Pax Centre and this path of doing MDMA-assisted therapy. But I'm curious to know, your life is still continuing while you were trying to do this therapy, and the way you've just described the thoughts in your mind and how everything was kind of shaken up a little bit. Was it hard for you to engage in quote unquote normal life while you were going through this therapy, to write a shopping list, to, interact with your kids' teachers at school, to have any sort of relationship with your husband or family or friends? Was that hard while you were undergoing this therapy, or was it just not a focus for you at all because you were so intent on trying to heal?
That's a good question. It was brutal hard. It was really, really hard. like undergoing a major surgery or something, and you've got an intense recovery that you need to do. It was a lot of the physical side effects I had were, we didn't anticipate them. But again, in saying that, I would have done it all again. There's no doubt. It was all worth it. You can't really undergo, for example, a knee reconstruction because you need to get a new knee and not go, well, I need to do the rehab. It's going to hurt. It's going to take time, but I need to do that. It's the same kind of process that I look at. But it was super difficult, and my youngest wasn't even 1, and my daughter was just about to turn 4. We were very fortunate that my husband just happened to be on annual leave at the time. Otherwise, it would have been... We got through a lot with the help of family, but funnily enough, I had never told anyone about this. So my family never knew I had PTSD, never knew about work. So asking for help and explaining everything was a really big deal to me at the time as well. So it sort of added just another layer of complexity to the situation. But we just tried to do the best we could. My husband just had to do everything, whether it was the kids, cleaning the house, getting them to school, just every single task that needed to be done. He had to do it, and I tried to help, and I often made things worse because my mind was so jumbled. I just needed to rest, to sleep, to shut my eyes. But obviously having kids, it doesn't really lend to having a rest. And so it took a long time to get back to, I guess, a functioning level.
Do you think that the MDMA-assisted therapy cured your PTSD, to put it really simply?
It did. I don't have PTSD anymore, to put it simply. Yeah. I've filling out the questionnaires. I remember filling them out last year, and it was things about anxiety and whatnot. And I remember thinking that these aren't questionnaires. These are just statements of my life. This is just how I would describe myself as much as I'd describe the colour of my hair. And that really surprised me because I thought I was doing really well at that point, that all these characteristics that people don't normally feel like that this isn't how normal, that people don't normally go through life. And I just couldn't imagine what life would be like without all that, without this crushing band around my chest, feeling like I couldn't breathe, just constantly being in that fight or flight mode and irritable and lashing out. But yeah, the MDMA, realistically the first dose was the biggest. The second dose definitely needed to go through as well. And I now just feel like the event that led me to the Pax Centre, that one job that I did, it's in the past. It's filed away as a memory where it should be. It's really that simple. The MDMA just helped to, if you imagine yourself as sort of a shiny gold stone is sort of yourself, your soul, whatever you want to call it. And trauma just sort of piles and piles crap on top of it. So over those 10 years, things just kept piling up until I did this one job. And then the day-to-day things in life just kept adding to it. So where normally you'd be able to deal with things and remove that, I didn't have that ability. So I just felt like all these even just like little day-to-day problems or big problems just got piled and piled and piled until it was just unmanageable. And taking these tablets, doing the MDMA, was like a high-pressure cleaner that just removed all of that and left me with, it wasn't about fixing me, it was about removing all that built-up trauma and left me with who I always was.
That's really powerful. Thank you for sharing that, Kate. Look, before we let you go, I did want to ask, clearly you had a good experience and it worked for you. However, there is criticism of this therapy that it's not researched enough, that it's dangerous to expand it any further before we really look deep into it and make sure that it's safe. What's your response to that criticism?
Oh, I would have been beyond disappointed if someone had said, you have this option, but we're not going to give it to you. So, I view it that I'm an adult. I can make my own choices. Everything in life, whether it is surgeries or so many things that are day-to-day, chemotherapy, like all these treatments can have side effects. There's no guarantees for maybe the surgeries that you go into. There's always risk. And at this point I would have done anything because I wasn't a part of life. I wasn't living life. If my husband wasn't the man that he was, we would have been divorced long ago. It's just not life. So I would have done anything. And I really hope that this treatment does continue to grow and to develop and be able to be available to anyone that needs it. I mean, just looking at the very small world in first responders would be, and within the army, like all those sorts of categories would be life-changing for what people assume is just their normal. It doesn't have to be their normal. You know, they can be a little bit more connected to life and find a little bit more joy, or just be open to not holding on to all of those things from their past. And if you're in the position to try it, then what's the worst case that happens? You know, nothing changes, but what if it does? You know, that could mean your life.
Kate, thank you so much for sharing your story with us. You've been really open and vulnerable, and we appreciate it. Thank you so much for talking to us on The Briefing.
Lovely. Thank you very much for having me.
That was Kate, not her real name, speaking to me there about her journey treating PTSD with MDMA-assisted therapy. Thanks so much for listening to this episode and this special series brought to you by The Briefing. That is it for now. Before you go, we would love it if you could share this episode with someone who you think might enjoy it or get something out of it. And if you want to see our other content, we put heaps up on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. We're also on TikTok and YouTube. Search Listener Newsroom. I'm Sacha Barbour Gatt. We'll see you next time.
Listener.